August 1945. The city of Hiroshima lies in ruins, its once bustling streets reduced to a ghostly silence. The air is thick with the stench of smoke and destruction, and the remnants of buildings rise like jagged skeletons against the scorched sky. Yet, amidst the devastation, a different scene unfolds, one that seems almost impossible in such a shattered world. A group of American soldiers, hardened by the brutal Pacific campaign, step through the rubble. They move cautiously, but with a sense of purpose. As they make their way through the wreckage, they come across a small group of Japanese civilians, displaced, fearful, and unsure of what to do next. The soldiers stop. In a moment that defies the brutality of war, they offer the one thing the civilians never expected: shelter. For the Japanese, whose homes and families had been torn apart by the bombings, this act of kindness is unfathomable. The same enemy they had once feared and fought against is now offering them protection in their darkest hour. The civilians, still reeling from the unimaginable destruction, stare in disbelief at the men who had just been their adversaries. In the ashes of war, a new reality is unfolding, one that challenges the very essence of hatred and violence. A strange bond is forming, built not on the scars of battle, but on an unexpected gesture of humanity. By the summer of 1945, World War II was nearing its devastating conclusion. The Axis powers had been pushed to the brink, their forces exhausted and retreating on all fronts. In Europe, the Allies had already overrun Nazi Germany, but in the Pacific, the war was still raging with a fierce intensity. The Japanese Empire, under the leadership of Emperor Hirohito, had vowed to fight to the last man, and the conflict showed no signs of slowing down. The United States, determined to bring the war to a swift end, faced an increasingly difficult challenge. Japan, though reeling from years of heavy Allied bombardment, was showing no signs of surrender. American forces had been engaged in an arduous island-hopping campaign, battling entrenched Japanese forces in places like Iwo Jima and Okinawa. The Japanese military's resilience and their refusal to surrender were costing both sides countless lives. The war had dragged on longer than anticipated, and the cost of invading Japan directly was expected to be catastrophic. The U.S. estimated that an invasion would result in hundreds of thousands of American casualties and potentially millions of Japanese deaths. It was in this context, and after the successful testing of the atomic bomb in July 1945, that President Harry S. Truman made the momentous decision to use the weapon on Japan. On August 6, 1945, the United States dropped the first atomic bomb on the city of Hiroshima. The bomb, nicknamed Little Boy, unleashed unprecedented destruction, killing an estimated 70,000 people instantly. Thousands more would die in the weeks and months that followed, from burns, radiation sickness, and the collapse of infrastructure. Despite this horrific display of power, the Japanese government refused to surrender, and the American military was prepared to continue its bombing campaign. 3 days later, on August 9th, a second bomb, Fat Man, was dropped on Nagasaki, a city that had been a major industrial hub for Japan. The effects were similarly catastrophic, and by this point, Japan was in a state of sheer devastation. Both cities had been leveled, leaving countless civilians in a state of homelessness, fear, and despair. In the wake of these bombings, the Japanese civilian population was faced with unimaginable suffering. The cities were in ruins, infrastructure was non-existent, and the people were left to wander in a wasteland of destruction. But it was during this time of desperation that an unexpected and profoundly human interaction took place. American troops, who had seen the devastation themselves in the wake of the bombings, entered the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in the immediate aftermath of the explosions. Though their mission was primarily military, the soldiers found themselves confronted with the suffering of the very people they had been fighting. These civilians, broken by the violence of the bomb, were left with no place to go, and many of them, still in shock, had no idea how to survive in the aftermath. It was then that American soldiers, often the same men who had just weeks earlier been locked in brutal combat with the Japanese, began to offer assistance. They provided shelter, food, and medical aid to the survivors, acts of humanity that no one had expected. For the Japanese civilians, the sight of the enemy offering help was almost beyond comprehension. How could the same people who had just leveled their homes and families now be the ones to offer protection and care? This moment of compassion, born from the ashes of war, was as unexpected as it was poignant. The hatred and violence that had defined the Pacific War seemed, for a brief moment, to be washed away in the face of human decency. American soldiers, under orders to secure the area and assist in the post-bombing recovery, were now forced to confront the cost of the war in a deeply personal way. The Japanese civilians, who had feared the Americans with a deep, abiding hatred, now found themselves in a paradoxical position. They were in the hands of their former enemies, yet those enemies were the ones offering them shelter in their darkest hour. For the civilians of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the atomic bombings were not just acts of warfare. They were the obliteration of their world. Families, homes, and entire neighborhoods were reduced to rubble in a matter of seconds. The survivors found themselves living in a desolate, unfamiliar landscape, their lives turned upside down by a single moment of unimaginable destruction. The bombings did not just physically destroy the cities, but they broke the spirit of the people who lived there. Japanese civilians, already exhausted from years of war, were now left with nothing. Most of the buildings were flattened, leaving only the charred remains of what once were homes. Those who had survived the initial blasts were often left without shelter, food, or medical supplies, and they wandered the wreckage in a stunned, almost trance-like state. The devastation was so complete that it felt like the very essence of their existence had been erased. Many of these survivors were also forced to confront the death of loved ones. The toll of the bombings was overwhelming. Entire families were wiped out in an instant. The few who survived were often left to sift through the ruins, searching for remnants of their old lives amidst the ashes. Amidst the grief and trauma, there was also a sense of helplessness. The civilians of Hiroshima and Nagasaki had been living under a constant cloud of fear and uncertainty, but nothing could have prepared them for the devastating reality of the atomic bomb. For these survivors, the arrival of American soldiers in the wake of the bombings was almost incomprehensible. The Japanese people had lived under constant propaganda that portrayed Americans as their ultimate enemy. Now, in their time of need, they were faced with soldiers of that very same enemy offering help. It was a profound contradiction, one that shook their beliefs and forced them to reconsider everything they had been taught during the war. In a deeply human moment, these civilians were forced to reconcile their hatred and fear of the enemy with the overwhelming kindness they received. The soldiers, who had once been their adversaries, now provided shelter, medical care, and even food. This act of humanity, in the midst of such devastation, became a source of bewilderment for the Japanese people, as well as a powerful symbol of the war's complex and often contradictory realities. The role of the American military in the aftermath of the atomic bombings was more complicated than mere occupation. While the primary objective of the U.S. forces was to secure the bombed cities and ensure that the Japanese would not retaliate, American soldiers quickly found themselves in a position where they were forced to address the immediate humanitarian crisis left in the wake of the bombings. In addition to their military duties, the U.S. troops were tasked with managing the chaotic environment left by the bombings. This included organizing the transportation of survivors to safer areas, providing basic medical care, and ensuring that the remaining civilians received food and shelter. It was a delicate balancing act. American soldiers, still fresh from their campaigns in the Pacific, now found themselves not as combatants, but as aid workers, doing what they could to alleviate the suffering of the very people they had been fighting just weeks earlier. This shift from soldier to humanitarian did not come easily. Many American troops, who had just witnessed the scale of destruction and the suffering inflicted by the atomic bomb, were deeply affected by the scene unfolding before them. Yet, they understood that their mission was now different. They had to ensure the Japanese civilians would survive in a world that had been irreparably altered by the war. In some ways, this shift in duty marked a turning point for the American military as well. Many soldiers began to see the Japanese people not as the enemy, but as victims of the war. As the American troops moved through the wreckage, they began to interact with the survivors in a way that transcended the brutal nature of the conflict. For some, it was a chance to show compassion for those who had suffered so much, while for others, it was a chance to rethink their understanding of the enemy. For the American forces, this moment was a stark reminder of the deep human cost of the war. While their victory was now certain, it came with the heavy burden of responsibility for the aftermath. The soldiers, many of whom had lost comrades in brutal battles, now had to come to terms with the destruction they had helped unleash. In this sense, the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki would forever remain a paradox, one of the greatest military victories of the war, yet one that had left a trail of immense suffering in its wake. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki represented a profound leap in military technology. The sheer destructive power of these weapons was unlike anything the world had ever seen. The technology that created these bombs, the culmination of the Manhattan Project, had been designed with one clear purpose: to end the war swiftly and decisively. When the atomic bomb detonated over Hiroshima on August 6, 1945, it unleashed an energy equivalent to approximately 15,000 tons of TNT. The explosion vaporized much of the city, leaving a crater of devastation. In an instant, the bomb wiped out nearly everything in its immediate vicinity. The few survivors in the area were subjected to a range of horrific effects: instant burns, radiation sickness, and the collapse of the very infrastructure they had relied on. The destructive power of the bomb was so overwhelming that it altered the very nature of warfare. No longer could nations simply rely on conventional artillery or bombers to wage war. Now, the threat of nuclear annihilation loomed large. In Nagasaki, the second bomb, Fat Man, detonated on August 9, 1945, with an even greater force. The terrain of the city, with its hills and valleys, slightly mitigated the bomb's total destructive power, but the results were no less devastating. Thousands of civilians perished instantly, while others were left to suffer the lingering effects of radiation poisoning. For the American military, the decision to use the atomic bomb was driven by the belief that it would bring the war to an end swiftly, without the need for a costly invasion of Japan. The bomb's devastating power, it was hoped, would force Japan to surrender without further bloodshed. But the immediate effects of the bomb and the lingering consequences for the survivors revealed the terrifying capabilities of nuclear weapons. The world was now faced with a new and harrowing reality, one where the sheer scale of destruction could no longer be fathomed or contained. The technology that had created the atomic bomb was a double-edged sword. While it brought the war in the Pacific to a rapid conclusion, it also raised profound ethical and moral questions. The bomb had not only destroyed cities and killed tens of thousands of civilians, but it had also introduced a new era of warfare, one where the very survival of humanity seemed precariously balanced on the possibility of nuclear conflict. The power unleashed by these bombs would forever alter the course of history, and the lessons learned from their use would resonate throughout the Cold War, and, beyond, the decision to drop atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki remains one of the most controversial and debated actions in modern history. While many argue that it was necessary to bring the war to a swift end and save lives in the long run, others contend that the bombings were morally indefensible, particularly given the catastrophic toll they took on civilian populations. For the civilians of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, The bombings were nothing short of an existential nightmare. The immediate deaths caused by the blasts were compounded by the long-term suffering of survivors, many of whom endured excruciating pain from radiation sickness, burns, and psychological trauma. These were not soldiers engaged in battle, but ordinary men, women, and children, caught in the crossfire of a war they had little say in. The survivors, known as hibakusha, would live with the scars of the bombings for the rest of their lives, physically and emotionally. The American decision to deploy nuclear weapons was influenced by a desire to avoid the bloodshed of a prolonged invasion of Japan. The U.S. military leadership believed that using the atomic bomb would save lives by forcing Japan to surrender quickly, rather than enduring the grueling and bloody fight that awaited in the Japanese homeland. Yet, this rationale has been widely debated. Was it truly necessary to destroy two cities and cause the deaths of hundreds of thousands of civilians to achieve this goal? Could the U.S. have pursued alternative strategies to end the war? In hindsight, the bombings raise profound moral questions about the justification of using weapons of such unprecedented destructive power. The civilian toll was catastrophic, and many argue that the decision to target civilian populations with atomic bombs was a step too far, even in the context of total war. It is a moral dilemma that continues to stir debate in the decades following the war, as the world grapples with the consequences of nuclear warfare. For the American soldiers who offered shelter and care to Japanese civilians in the wake of the bombings, this moral complexity was felt deeply. They had just been part of a military operation that had unleashed unspeakable devastation. Yet here they were, faced with the immediate human cost of that decision. The soldiers had witnessed the horrors of battle, but nothing could have prepared them for the aftermath of the bombings, the sight of survivors, shell-shocked and broken, wandering through the ruins. In this moment, the soldiers had to reconcile the military objectives with the human realities that had unfolded in the wake of the atomic blasts. On the morning of August 6, 1945, the world witnessed a moment that would forever change the course of history. At 8:15 a.m., the atomic bomb Little Boy was dropped over Hiroshima, detonating with a force equivalent to 15,000 tons of TNT. In an instant, the city, home to over 350,000 civilians, was obliterated. The blast killed 70,000 people immediately, with thousands more succumbing to burns, radiation, and injuries in the weeks and months that followed. What had once been a bustling, vibrant city was now a charred wasteland, its skyline replaced by a toxic cloud of smoke and dust. The destruction of Hiroshima was followed by the bombing of Nagasaki just 3 days later, on August 9th. Fat Man, the second atomic bomb, dropped over this industrial port city, killed an estimated 40,000 people instantly. Despite the city's geography, which offered some protection from the full blast, the results were catastrophic. In both cases, survivors were left to confront not only the immediate devastation, but also the slow and agonizing toll of radiation sickness, burns, and the collapse of their homes and society. For the civilians who survived, the bombings were a nightmare that defied explanation. Those who had once lived in fear of air raids now faced a new kind of terror, one that came from the very sky above them, but in a form that was entirely beyond anything they had imagined. The impact was not just physical, but psychological. Families were torn apart, entire communities were destroyed, and the survivors found themselves without shelter, food, or hope. As the war's final days approached, the American leadership watched as the Japanese continued to refuse surrender. The bombings were part of a strategic effort to force Japan into submission, and by August 9th, American leaders knew that Japan's refusal to surrender was the last major obstacle to ending the war in the Pacific. However, what followed the bombings was both expected and unexpected. While Japan did not immediately surrender, the sheer scale of destruction and the horrifying images of the bomb's aftermath did begin to wear down the resolve of the Japanese leadership. In the aftermath of the bombings, U.S. military commanders and politicians were left grappling with the consequences of using such a powerful weapon. The decision to drop the bomb was not made lightly. American officials, in their bid to end the war quickly and avoid a costly invasion of Japan, had chosen the atomic bomb as their ultimate weapon. It was a decision that, in hindsight, would shape the global landscape for decades to come. But even as the American forces prepared for the next stage of the war, they were faced with an unexpected consequence: the response of the Japanese civilians themselves. Those who had survived the bombs found themselves in an unimaginable position. In the wake of the atomic explosions, the survivors faced not only the physical destruction of their cities, but also a profound emotional and psychological trauma that many could not have prepared for. They were now living in a world that had been forever altered by the bomb. At the same time, American soldiers, who had been part of the military campaign to destroy Japan's military power, now found themselves in a position they had never anticipated. As the U.S. military moved into the bombed cities, many soldiers came face to face with the victims of the very weapon they had helped deploy. It was a situation that no one had fully prepared for, and it would become a defining moment in the war's aftermath. For the civilians, the turning point came not just with the destruction of their cities, but with the arrival of the American soldiers, who now offered them something unexpected: shelter. To the survivors, the Americans were not just their enemies. They were the very force that had brought their cities to ruin. And yet, these soldiers, who had been part of the brutal campaign against Japan, now extended a hand of mercy. This unexpected act of humanity, the offer of shelter, food, and medical aid, was as much a shock to the Japanese survivors as the bombs had been just days before. The soldiers, too, faced a moral reckoning. Having witnessed the devastation of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, many were confronted with the human cost of the atomic bomb. The question of whether the bombings had been worth the lives lost weighed heavily on their consciences. They were no longer just soldiers engaged in battle. They were witnesses to the horrors that war could bring. And now they were asked to help the very people they had once fought against. The moment when American soldiers began offering shelter to Japanese civilians was a profound and unexpected one. The men who had just been part of the bombing raids that obliterated Hiroshima and Nagasaki now found themselves in a position of extraordinary human complexity. As soldiers who had long been trained to fight, their roles had shifted drastically in the wake of the destruction they had helped bring about. They were no longer merely warriors in combat, but also caretakers in a shattered landscape, faced with the suffering they had contributed to. Many of these soldiers, deeply impacted by the sheer devastation they had witnessed, began to question the very nature of their mission. The destruction of 2 entire cities, the deaths of tens of thousands of civilians, and the lingering agony of the survivors left a deep emotional imprint on the soldiers. For some, the sight of the survivors wandering through the ruins, homeless, injured, and haunted by the trauma of the bombings, was difficult to reconcile with the idea of victory. The Japanese civilians they encountered were no longer the enemy, but fellow human beings who had been caught in the brutal grip of war. Yet, amid this confusion, the soldiers' actions spoke volumes. They offered food, water, and shelter to the survivors, often going out of their way to assist those in desperate need. The irony was not lost on the Japanese civilians, who had once been told that their enemies would bring nothing but death and destruction. Now, the same men who had been part of that destruction were offering an unexpected lifeline to the survivors. The emotional toll of the moment was immense. For the Japanese civilians, the sight of the American soldiers was both a reminder of the terror they had endured and an almost incomprehensible act of kindness. Many of the survivors had been taught to fear and hate the Americans, and yet these very soldiers were now offering them shelter in the aftermath of the bombings. For the first time, the civilians found themselves forced to confront the complexity of war and the humanity of those they had once seen as their mortal enemies. On the American side, The soldiers' efforts to help the survivors were not without their challenges. Despite their best intentions, there were logistical hurdles. There was still a war to win, and the needs of the survivors were overwhelming. Yet, despite the chaos, the soldiers pressed on, offering what little they could in the face of such immense devastation. It was a quiet rebellion against the violence that had defined their war, and a stark reminder of the emotional and psychological costs of conflict. For the survivors, the bombings had marked the end of their world. Hiroshima and Nagasaki were not just cities. They were homes, communities, and symbols of the lives that had been lost. The idea that anyone, let alone the Americans, would offer them help seemed like an impossible dream. Yet, in the days following the bombings, these survivors discovered that in the ashes of destruction, there could still be acts of kindness. However small, as the U.S. military continued its occupation of Japan in the months following the bombings, the offer of shelter by American soldiers became a symbol of the strange reconciliation that followed the devastation. The survivors, scarred by the horrors of the bombings, were now forced to rebuild their lives, but they did so under the shadow of a new, yet complex reality. The destruction wrought by the atomic bombs could not be undone, but the actions of the soldiers, their unexpected humanity in the face of such overwhelming loss, became an essential part of the story of post-war Japan. For the American forces, these acts of kindness would forever define their time in Japan. They were not just occupiers, but witnesses to the cost of their own actions. It was a turning point, not just in the war, but in the very nature of human conflict. The soldiers who extended shelter to their former enemies were doing more than offering aid. They were participating in a delicate, difficult and emotional process of healing, one that could not undo the past but might, in some small way, offer a glimpse of humanity amidst the wreckage of war. The aftermath of the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki had far-reaching consequences, not only for Japan, but for the entire world. The immediate effects were catastrophic. Tens of thousands of people dead, entire cities reduced to rubble, and survivors left to navigate a world that had been forever altered. Yet, beyond the physical devastation, the emotional and psychological impact on both the Japanese civilians and the American soldiers who had dropped the bombs was just beginning to unfold. For Japan, the bombings shattered the illusion of invulnerability that had defined their wartime spirit. The bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki marked the final stage of the Pacific War, and for the Japanese leadership, there was no escaping the reality that their resistance was coming to an end. In the face of such overwhelming destruction, the Japanese government, under Emperor Hirohito, was finally forced to consider surrender. On August 15, 1945, just days after the second bombing, Japan announced its unconditional surrender, bringing an end to World War II. The decision to surrender was a monumental shift in Japanese military thinking, and it came in the wake of devastation that left the nation in shock. Hiroshima and Nagasaki, once proud cities, had been reduced to ashes, and their citizens were left to deal with the horrors of radiation sickness, burns, and trauma. In the weeks following the bombings, the true scale of the destruction became clearer. The survivors, many of whom had lost family members, homes, and everything they had known, were now left to rebuild their lives amidst the ruins. For the American soldiers who had been part of the bombing campaign, the aftermath was equally complex. While the decision to use the atomic bombs was justified at the time as a means to end the war quickly and save lives, the psychological toll on the soldiers who had carried out the bombings was profound. The sheer destruction they had witnessed and the long-term effects on the civilian population forced many to grapple with the morality of their actions. Many soldiers, who had been trained for combat, found themselves in a position of moral ambiguity, forced to reconcile their role in the bombings with the human suffering that followed. In the wake of the bombings, a growing sense of guilt and moral questioning took hold among both the military and the public. The devastation of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, as well as the overwhelming toll on Japanese civilians, forced the world to confront the terrifying potential of nuclear weapons. The bombings not only marked the end of World War II, but also set the stage for the Cold War, as the United States and the Soviet Union began their own nuclear arms race. The civilian population of Japan, meanwhile, was left to pick up the pieces. The survivors of the bombings, known as hibakusha, faced a long and difficult journey of recovery. Many were physically scarred, suffering from radiation burns, cancer, and the psychological trauma of witnessing the destruction of their cities. Yet, despite the hardships, the hibakusha became a symbol of survival and resilience. Their stories of survival, loss, and rebuilding would shape post-war Japan and eventually contribute to the country's rise as a global economic power in the decades to come. As the U.S. occupation began in Japan, the arrival of American soldiers who offered shelter to the Japanese civilians became a symbolic moment of reconciliation, however complex. These acts of kindness, though small in the grand scope of the war, were deeply significant. For the survivors, the sight of their former enemies now offering aid was a shock, an emotional jolt that challenged their understanding of the war. In some ways, it marked the beginning of a new chapter in the relationship between the United States and Japan, one where the bitter animosities of the past were slowly replaced by cooperation, albeit with lingering scars. The conclusion of the war and the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki not only marked the end of conflict, but set the stage for a new world order. The atomic bombings fundamentally altered the landscape of international relations and ushered in the age of nuclear weapons, changing the dynamics of global power forever. For Japan, the immediate aftermath was one of chaos and survival. The surrender of Japan on August 15, 1945, after the bombings, signaled the collapse of the military government and the beginning of Japan's occupation by the United States. General Douglas MacArthur, appointed as the supreme commander for the Allied powers, oversaw the reconstruction of Japan. Despite the devastation, Japan's remarkable ability to rebuild in the post-war years became a defining feature of the nation's story. The scars of the atomic bombings remained, but in the decades following the war, Japan would rise to become a global economic powerhouse. This rapid recovery, often referred to as the Japanese economic miracle, was underpinned by American assistance, reforms, and Japan's own resilience. For the survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, known as the hibakusha, the aftermath was far more personal. Many faced years of physical suffering due to radiation exposure, resulting in chronic illnesses such as leukemia, cancer, and other long-term health problems. The mental and emotional scars of witnessing such massive destruction were equally profound. These survivors not only lost their homes and loved ones, but also faced societal stigma. In the years following the bombings, hibakusha often found themselves marginalized, facing both physical ailments and social discrimination. The Japanese government, however, began to recognize the plight of the hibakusha, and in the 1950s, legislation was passed to provide medical care and financial assistance to those affected by the bombs. This marked a turning point in the acknowledgement of the bombing's effects, as Japan began to grapple with the lasting consequences of the atomic age. Over time, the hibakusha became symbols of resilience, advocating for peace and the abolition of nuclear weapons. Their experiences would influence global peace movements and bring attention to the horrors of nuclear warfare. On the international stage, the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki fundamentally shifted the nature of warfare and geopolitics. The United States, having successfully used nuclear weapons to end the war, became the first nuclear power, initiating the nuclear arms race with the Soviet Union. The bombings marked the beginning of the Cold War era, where the fear of nuclear annihilation became a central theme in global politics. This fear would define international relations for the next several decades as the U.S. and the Soviet Union, along with other nations, competed to build more advanced nuclear arsenals. The bombings also left the world with an ethical and philosophical question that continues to resonate. Was the use of the atomic bomb justified? In the years following the war, this question would spark heated debates among politicians, historians, and civilians alike. Some argued that the bombings were necessary to end the war quickly and save lives, while others believed that the use of such a destructive weapon on civilian populations was morally indefensible. For the U.S. military, the immediate aftermath was a mixture of triumph and uncertainty. The successful use of the atomic bomb undoubtedly contributed to the end of the war in the Pacific, but the long-term consequences were not fully understood at the time. The effects of radiation on the human body were still not well known, and the broader implications of nuclear weapons in global conflict had not yet been realized. The psychological toll on the soldiers involved in the bombings, as well as the moral implications of their actions, were challenges that the American military would face for years to come. As the Cold War progressed, the fear of nuclear weapons spread across the globe. The bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki remained as stark reminders of the destructive power humanity had unlocked. The images of the bombed cities, the suffering of the survivors, and the international shifts in power formed the backdrop to the nuclear arms race, where the world stood on the brink of potentially catastrophic conflict. In the years following World War II, the United States and Japan embarked on a journey of reconciliation. The bond between the two nations, once defined by bitter enmity, gradually shifted to one of partnership. Japan, under American guidance, adopted a new constitution that renounced war and focused on rebuilding its society. The U.S. and Japan formed a strategic alliance during the Cold War, with Japan emerging as a crucial economic and political partner in Asia. Yet, the painful legacy of the bombings remained an open wound, a reminder of the destruction that had been wrought and the complex legacy that still hung over both nations. The bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki are indelibly etched into the history of the 20th century, not only as a tragic chapter of World War II, but also as a stark reminder of the devastating power humanity has at its disposal. These bombings brought an end to a brutal conflict, but they also initiated a new era of warfare, one that forever altered the nature of global power and human existence. The destructive power of the atomic bomb, unleashed upon these two cities, was a profound moment in history that left a lasting legacy. For Japan, the aftermath was a deep, enduring trauma. The survivors of the bombings, the hibakusha, embodied the unimaginable cost of war. The physical and psychological scars they carried were a constant reminder of the horrors of nuclear warfare. And yet, amidst this suffering, Japan managed to rebuild itself, emerging from the rubble of its destroyed cities into a thriving nation. The resilience of the Japanese people in the face of such devastation remains a testament to the strength of the human spirit, even in the darkest of times. For the United States, the bombings were a moment of triumph, but also of deep moral reckoning. The decision to drop the atomic bombs on Japan was seen by many as a necessary step to end the war, but it raised profound ethical questions that have persisted to this day. The emotional and psychological toll on the soldiers who were involved in the bombings was not fully understood at the time, but it was a heavy burden that many would carry for the rest of their lives. The atomic bombings were a pivotal moment in military history, and their legacy continues to shape our understanding of warfare, peace, and the value of human life. In the decades following the war, the use of nuclear weapons would spark an arms race that brought the world to the brink of nuclear annihilation. The bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, as horrific as they were, ultimately prompted a global reckoning with the threat of nuclear warfare. The sheer destructive potential of these weapons became impossible to ignore, and the horrors of the bombings served as a constant reminder of the need for peace and disarmament. For the global community, the lessons of Hiroshima and Nagasaki are still relevant today. In an age where nuclear weapons continue to exist, the question of how we manage the potential for such destruction remains a pressing issue. The bombings highlighted the terrifying possibility of total annihilation, yet they also underscored the resilience and capacity for compassion that can emerge from the ashes of war. As the survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki have shown, even in the face of incomprehensible loss and destruction, there is a path toward healing and reconciliation. These cities, once symbols of devastation, became symbols of recovery and hope. The bond that developed between the United States and Japan in the years following the war, while born from shared sacrifice and reconciliation, serves as a testament to the possibility of overcoming hatred and building a future rooted in peace. Feitudun Tin. Bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki stand as a reminder of both the horrors of war and the unyielding power of the human spirit to rebuild and move forward. They are an indelible part of our shared history, and their legacy calls on each generation to choose peace over destruction, to seek understanding in the face of division, and to ensure that such devastation is never repeated.